Good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone this morning to the Bristol County Continuum of Care's part of our resource training series. This today is Wednesday, June 26th, and we're excited to have a session on immigration at the intersection of homelessness. This is sort of a 101 intended for our homeless service providers and folks that are working and providing direct care and direct service within the community. So we're glad you're here with us. We are recording this session and hope to have this up on our website at nbhspn.com within the coming week, and hope to be able to share that resource out to the community for those that aren't able to attend this morning. So thank you for joining us, and welcome. We're very fortunate this morning to have with us three organizations highly respected, highly engaged in the community, with a variety of populations and experts in their respective fields. And we are going to be hearing from the Immigrants Assistance Center, the Community Economic Development Center, as well as Catholic Charities with the Diocese of Fall River. We have rock stars amongst us who are ready, willing, and more than able to provide you with great information. So with that, we're going to begin with, and I'd like to introduce you to the Executive Director of the Immigrants Assistance Center, Helena Da Silva Hughes, to begin us off this morning and to introduce this topic to us and provide us with some information. Helena, you are on.
Yes, well, good morning, everyone. So I'm going to start, I think it's basically so people can understand the different status of immigrants in our community, because I think there's a lot of confusion. People say immigrants and everybody just thinks everybody's in the same status, which is not. So in our community, we have legal permanent residents, which means green card holders. These are people who can apply for citizenship, can become U.S. citizens within 5 years of being in the United States with a green card. And with those legal permanent residents, these are residents that are eligible for programs. They can apply for housing, they can apply for food stamps, they can get mass health standards. So that's a population that is here that we can really provide services to and even help them become U.S. citizens and register to vote. And then there's the population that we hear a lot. It's called mixed immigration status. What I mean by mixed immigration status could be mom is undocumented, which means they have no papers. They might have come through the border, or they might have overstayed as a visitor and now has no status. But have a husband who might also have no status, but they might have children who have no status, but they might have a child born in the U.S., which means the child is a U.S. citizen. So that's that mixed immigration families that we work a lot with, and I'm sure a lot of you do. And so it's very difficult because you only have one person in the family, the U.S. citizen child, that is actually the one that is eligible to apply, that you can apply for benefits on behalf of that child. And then there is the population that is undocumented, which means they have no status. They are here they're living here in our areas, and the issue becomes very difficult because they are only eligible for mass health limited, which means they only have insurance in case there's an emergency, right? So they're utilizing we work very closely with the Greater New Bedford Health Center, who sees a lot of our families, and then they might go to the hospital, to the emergency room, because they do not get a primary care physician. So that is a lot of members of our community that fits into the criteria that it is very hard for them to get any benefits because they don't qualify for, right? Unless it's emergency health insurance. And so that becomes very challenging because a lot of times they only go to the doctors when they are very, very sick and they end up in the emergency room. And many times the prognosis is fatal. So we have seen quite a bit of that. And that's the population that it is growing in our community, and we call them the underground economy. So this is people who are working maybe in the fish houses, landscaping, they might be in construction, women might be cleaning homes, they might be even CNAs, but that's the population that is the underground economy that basically have no status, and they do not qualify for anything. So that being said, it is very challenging, and this population is very vulnerable. And what happens is they are so vulnerable that they are trying to get status. What I mean, they're trying to get a green card. Some of them might have gotten a working permit, which temporarily, and they might have to reapply. And this population, because they're so vulnerable and so desperate, we find that they become easy victims of scams. Right? So unfortunately, there are a lot of attorneys who basically will promise them a path to legalization, which there isn't any, or they might say, maybe you'll be applying for asylum, which it's important to know that only 90% of the asylum seekers do not get asylum. So as you can see, we see a lot of attorneys that are taking advantage, and notarios, who are taking advantage of people who are saying, okay, we're going to apply for asylum, knowing very well that they're not going to be applying, and these people just keep sending money, giving money to these attorneys. And this is something we see. I've gotten really upset with some attorneys because the reality is they do not qualify for anything, and there is no immigration relief that they can apply for. So that is what we are seeing in a nutshell here at the Immigrants Assistance Center. We are also working, which I think is important, we are working with the unaccompanied youth. These are kids that are coming through the border, they're into high school, or maybe some of them are in middle school right now. And what are we doing? We are going in, we've had a program called the Amigos Project. We've had it for the past 10 years at New Bedford High. And what we're doing is we have a case manager who is working with this slide, they call them with these students, and really making sure they understand what's happening. If they have immigration attorneys, we're translating their documents. We're always very carefully, because some of them, because they've been abandoned, they might qualify for a special juvenile visa. A special juvenile visa will get them to a green card. So we are working very closely with these students. 2 years ago, we hired a mental health specialist, Maria Jose Morales. She's from Nicaragua. And why? Because the mental health issue, because a lot of these kids have gone through trauma. So we've hired her because we know these kids don't have access to health insurance. So we've been fundraising to be able to have her as part of our team, so we can pay her so she can provide therapy for these students. And we're also working with the parenting teen programs. We have a girl who's like young girls who are getting pregnant, they're having children. And so Maria Jose is also working very closely with the parenting teen programs. So we are working, so the mental health is something we are seeing. So we're working with the students. Now in the summer, we continue to work with the students. We actually have a space here at the office that we're providing therapy for these students. And for the special juvenile visa, we've also hired an attorney who's doing 10 hours because these kids need to go into probate. So it's very limited. As you can see, we have very limited budget, but we are doing this very intentionally, knowing the barriers of this population that we serve. So I just wanted to make sure a lot of these students might have a sponsor. Some of them might be couch surfing. They might be sleeping with many other students in the same household because they cannot afford their rent. So we're seeing that. We're trying to educate the sponsors because as a sponsor of these students, they have an obligation. And what happens is they sign in their sponsors, but they're not complying with regulations. So I just wanted to mention, because that's the homeless students that we considered in New Bedford High now is actually really McKinney-Vento is actually now identifying, and we're helping them identify these students, because they might register and they might say they have a sponsor maybe in September, but maybe by October, they don't have a sponsor, right? So when they are couch surfing and they're being considered homeless. So that is one in a nutshell of what we are doing. It's a lot of hand holding. There's a lot of challenges, and we are very careful in making sure they don't become victims of scams and they are not being taken advantage, because we see in that, not just with notarios, we are seeing that with lawyers who know that they can, and these people have, these students have to send money back to their country. They have to basically meet the basic needs, and at the same time pay for the rent. So there's a lot of stress that's happening to these students. And so we just want to provide as much support as we can.
Excellent.
I don't know if there's any questions if we want, but I mean, I can go on about this, but this is the services. I'm just going to focus on this particular services that we are providing here. And of course we are, because of the rent, and I think we can all say the same thing, because of the increases of rent, and especially doubling rent, we're seeing a lot of also elders coming in that living with family members, and families having to move in with family members because they cannot afford their rent. And so that is something that I think we all see, and the mental health issue is going across the line, not just with students, with families and elders, that we're seeing that. So we just want to bring that up.
Well, thank you so much, Helena. That is a great kickoff and opening to this session. Does anyone have any questions or comments? You're always invited to put something in the chat if you want, but I'll give you a second now if you wanted to just shout out a question or anything for Helena at this point. Okay, I guess that
very
was
confusing. There's a lot. Immigration is extremely confusing. And I just wanted to make sure that an immigration reform bill is what we need. And we've been talking about for the past 30 years and nothing happens.
Okay, thank you. So unless there's anything further, and feel free to add any questions into the chat as we proceed. Thank you again, Helena, and I hope you have a couple minutes to stay on and be present if other questions and issues come up. Corinne Williams is the Executive Director at the CEDC within New Bedford, and we're grateful to have you join us here today, Corinne, to get some of your remarks and comments about what you're seeing and what you understand, particularly where it intersects with homelessness. But if you want to take it away, with everybody knowing that you can enter into the chat if you have anything, and we'll certainly provide you with contact information for everyone at the end of this, and we'll post that online as well. But Corinne, with no further ado, go ahead. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Jen. And it's really great to be here to be able to talk a little bit about some of the things that we're seeing over at the CEDC. We're located in the North End. We're currently located on North Brent Street in the heart of the neighborhood, where many new immigrants come to settle. Each generation has come to settle a lot of times up here in the North End. Generations ago, it was kind of driven by the mills that ring around the neighborhood, and people worked in the mills, and so there have been waves of immigrants that have created and built the neighborhood. And just like today, many immigrants have come to New Bedford for work and for economic opportunity. We talk a lot about the fishing industry and how important it is to our local economy. And that in many ways has been quite a driver for the growing Central American community that came already, 25 years ago. So the roots that the Latino community from Central America have put into the city and the neighborhoods. It's been really an important piece of our city as well, just like any other wave of immigration has built the city through businesses and economic activity. So we see a lot of the families, the Central American families, in terms of their strengths and in terms of how much they're contributing to the economy, because we do a lot of taxes, and we see, although it's an underground economy, people are paying their taxes and people are making money and they're investing in the neighborhoods and becoming first-time home buyers and investing in businesses. So that core of people, particularly from Guatemala, from El Salvador, have taken root in New Bedford. Maybe they started with a different immigration status, but over years have been able to adjust their status. And like Helena said, many of these are mixed status families where their children are U.S. citizens and entitled to benefits and all the privileges of being a U.S. citizen. But at the same time, kind of stuck in this limbo land of no immigration reform. So you might have someone who's been here for 20 years and built a life for themselves, but remained undocumented. So in Massachusetts, although there are very limited benefits like Mass Health Limited, there has been some reforms like being able to get a driver's license and drive safely on the roads and pay auto insurance, so you're not vulnerable to those kinds of that kind of exploitation in the workplace, because you have a little more freedom to travel a little bit further. But I kind of start with that to talk about those strengths of the immigrant community in terms of what we're seeing of patterns of new migration. So we hear a lot about what's going on in the border, and what's going on in the border isn't unrelated to our reality here in New Bedford, because many of the family members hear about the terrible violence that goes on in Central America, the extortion that happens for people who might have a relative and they're receiving funds and they end up getting extorted, or they end up getting persecuted by gangs or political violence, children who have been kidnapped. So a lot of times these family members are fleeing for their lives and have the support of family members here in New Bedford to provide some kind of support and sponsorship. So in some cases, there is it turns into a sponsor that might not have a strong relationship with an unaccompanied minor, and that turns into a social problem and leads to homelessness of youth. But at the same time, the vast majority are of these unaccompanied minors are being placed with relatives, with responsible sponsors who are able to assist them in achieving a special immigrant juvenile visa. But at the same time, and then there's also a number of people who come to the border and are seek to apply for asylum because they have been persecuted. So that tends to be this, what we tend to see are people who are just arriving from the border. That a lot of times we talk about the CDC as the triage center for many of the Central American immigrants in the city, where we'll get the first packet of paperwork that people get from the border, and we take a careful look at that to make sure that they're in compliance, that they need to check in with ICE, that they need to be aware if they have a court date that's coming up or a hearing that's coming up later, and to share very important resources, and I'm so glad Ken's here, of immigration resources for getting a consultation, preferably with a pro bono immigration resource that can give you an orientation about whether or not it makes sense for you to pursue an asylum claim or a special immigrant juvenile visa, or other kinds of other avenues of immigration relief. So we kind of direct people and try to resource around these kinds of circumstances. But and again, to really think about the immigrant community themselves from Central America being the heroes of being able to save people from horrendous situations that are going on in Central America that we have to acknowledge. And then the kind of trauma that people go through. I mean, I've heard stories, we've worked with kids from, and you've heard them too, Helena, about kids who have come up from the border who spent 72 hours in the back of a locked truck with 50 other people. And we've heard about those kinds of tragedies. And those are the children that are in our school systems and need that kind of support and mental health assistance that we really need to bolster. We do, and with all the trauma and the stress that goes on through the journey and what they've lived through in Central America, we know that a lot of this lack of health coverage or access to healthcare can lead to other kinds of social problems and social ills, of substance abuse, of alcohol abuse. And so sometimes we'll find that typically if someone's living in a household, not adjusting very well and turning to alcohol and creating a problem for the others that are living in the household, then those are the people that become vulnerable to homelessness. And we find that here and there, and quite frequently in the neighborhood. And oftentimes it's very difficult to resource for these folks, because a lot of the systems are difficult enough to navigate. Never mind if you have a language barrier, don't qualify for the right health insurance, and don't know where to go. So that's a piece that I see that's sort of driving a lot of the vulnerability to homelessness, along with the youth as well, that can turn into some issues around vulnerability and the tendency to have a lot of housing insecurity from both those populations. So those are the kind of things that we tend to see. And we assist and try to, get people an orientation and get them on their feet and send them in the right direction. But the reality is some of the services are quite limited. And sometimes it's difficult for us to figure it all out. If someone, and it actually happened that there was a young man that came from Honduras, and he thought a friend of his from back home would be able to take him in to his apartment. Well, when he got here, guess what? The friend, wasn't in a circumstance to be able to bring him in. So it turned into, turned into trying to figure out, well, is there a bed for him? How does he get into the COC system? How does, and of course, obviously it was like at the end of the day and on a Friday afternoon, as it always is, but giving us, I think for immigration service providers, it's really important for us to have the tools and the knowledge, and to kind of be able to help people navigate through some of those systems as well. So that's kind of what we're up to. And in some cases where, we're having to locate people that are somewhere in their journey and haven't actually made it into New Bedford yet. But it is it's been a pretty active season where there have been lots of people resettling in New Bedford. And, I had the opportunity to talk to someone that I've known for like 20 years, and his daughter and his children were born here. They're going to college, they're building their lives, and he was fleeing the violence from Guatemala. And just the other day he told me, well, guess what, I actually have my green card now. It took him, better part of 20 years to work through that process, but it is a possibility. And again, he and his family are contributing and important parts of our community. And so it's important really reflect on that and think about our own immigrant journeys in our past and our family's history, to, you know, instead of thinking about like, you know, just the issue around status, we do need immigration reform. And I'm glad that we're in Massachusetts, where there has been some acknowledgement about how important immigrants are to our communities, and how to best welcome folks into our communities, and to try to find that kind of support.
Excellent. Okay, do we have any questions for Corinne right off the bat? I know so far the first two speakers have so comprehensively covered this topic as to warrant no questions from anyone about anything. So it's clearly a testament to the great information that's coming out thus far. So Kenneth, you have a tough row to hoe here. Kenneth, and I'm going to completely destroy your last name, Amarigi?
Emerigi, yeah.
Emerigi, okay. Kenneth
Yeah.
Emerigi is joining us. He is an attorney with the Immigration Services at Catholic Charities of the Fall River Diocese, and will take us now through the legal portions and that which we need to know. Hopefully we'll do so without Latin or without complicating legal phrases, but we look forward to hearing your part of the presentation, Kenneth, and we ask that you take it away.
Thank you, Jen. As Helena said, immigration law is, I would say, unnecessarily complicated, and it's been compared to the IRS code in terms of its complexity, and frankly is probably more complex, especially given the fact that there are almost daily proclamations from the President of the United States, as well as our other elected officials that often muddy the waters. So I'm going to do my best. We do have a slideshow to accompany this. One of my staff members, Jen, is here, Sarah Bizzaro. I believe she's going to try to share her screen so she can walk through the slideshow with us. And while you're doing that, I'll just give you a brief introduction of who we are and who I am. As Jen said, we are the Catholic Charities of the Diocese of Fall River. We have our main office in Fall River, but we also have offices in New Bedford and Hyannis. Our service area is the entirety of the diocese, which covers obviously New Bedford and a large portion of southeastern Mass. I'm actually a native Rhode Islander. Don't hold that against me, but I do have a special place in my heart for New Bedford. Much to Corinne's point, my maternal grandparents immigrated to New Bedford in the early 1900s from Portugal. My mother grew up there, and my family for 80 plus years was involved in the seafood industry. So I spent about 5 to 6 days a week in the fish cutting houses for the better part of my 20s. So I'm familiar with the community. I love the community, and hopefully this overview can at least help cut through some of the noise for you. So Sarah, whenever you're ready.
I'm ready. Can you see my screen?
Yes. Can everybody see the screen?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, so this presentation is broken into 3 parts. I don't want to be overly redundant or bore anybody to death, so I am going to probably skip around a little bit. Some of what I had to say has already been addressed, and importantly, in looking this over this morning, I realized just over the last 2 to 3 months with some of the dictates that have come down from above, some of this is not 100% accurate, but it probably will remain accurate because as you probably know, litigation often shapes immigration law as well. So one day something's the law, the next day there's a hold. So I'm going to do my best again, just to give you a general overview of what you're seeing out there and just a very base level understanding of what immigration law is and what your constituencies are facing. Part 1 is immigration status basics. Sarah? Okay, so as Helena started off with, there are a variety of terms being used. I think one of the biggest pet peeves that we as legal practitioners have is that there are a lot of terms that mean something legally, whereas there are a lot of also terms that don't have legal import, but they tend to get mixed up. Also, the media does not help because they use certain terms in a very loaded fashion to connote negative implications or positive, depending on how they're trying to spin it. But at a very base level, who is an immigrant? An immigrant is somebody from another country. They could be here legally or illegally. They're an immigrant either way. And they could be here short term, or they could be here either on a long-term basis or attempting to achieve a long.
Kenneth, you seem to have frozen up. You want to? Sarah, is there any problem with your system over there? Can we hear you? Okay, well, we're having technical difficulties. Please stand by. I think, as you may have noticed, I think Kenneth is rebooting his system and probably coming back on. So thank you for your patience, and we'll get started again momentarily.
Can I just jump in about, some of the challenges that we face sometimes in trying to find placement? Do you have any insight about reaching resources that could address language barriers in the continuum of care system, about what the best process would be?
Sorry about that.
Kenneth, you're back on?
Yes, sorry about that. Our internet went down.
Yeah, okay. Corinne just posed a question. I don't want to dismiss that question.
Sure.
Corinne, you're asking about resources within the continuum?
Yeah. For language access, if someone's experiencing homelessness.
I typically look to people like Julie Medore or Helena to help me answer that question. I am not the expert in this, but if somebody would like to chime in on that, I'd appreciate that.
New Bedford Public Schools utilizes a tool called Lion Bridge for interpretation services over the phone. So that's something definitely, if you have families who need help accessing resources, we could help here from the office, from the registration center, from the Family Welcome Center, to help them access interpretation services for sure.
And as well at our family engagement centers across the district and the middle schools. We have wraparound and family engagement folks who work with these wonderful people that are here presenting. So if there is like, a Key speaker or something and they can't find documents, they can connect and possibly assist with that. We're starting to do all of our documents in at least 6 languages, and expressing that need across the city in all capacities. If we have a newcomer showing up here, we would love to be able to forward them to, libraries and City Hall and all different locations to be able to fit that need. And that is a growing need with Portuguese, Cape Verdean Creole, Haitian Creole, and the dialect of Quiche, but there's many others.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you, Trish, as well, both from the New Bedford Public Schools. That's that's helpful for us. Kenneth, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Sorry about
Welcome
that.
back.
Oh, thank you. And I did mean to say in my little introduction that apparently we are having some internet difficulties here today. So I apologize for that, and I hope it does not happen again.
That was exciting, and trust me when I tell you, we hope it doesn't happen again either. So there you go.
And I thought it was just. All right. So who is here legally? And this is important because this is going to speak to some of the not only the rights that these folks have, but more importantly, things that they're entitled to. Who is here legally? People on particular types of visas, certain types of work cards, DACA. DACA is a Dreamers Act, I'm sure you've all heard of. TPS, green card holders, which are also lawful or legal permanent residents, LPRs, you'll also hear that term. People who have been granted asylum or are here under one of the various programs that are announced on a regular basis with regards to refugees being allowed in the country on parole due to certain humanitarian crises. The most, I think, familiar for everyone right now would probably be Haiti. We're seeing a lot of Haitians pouring into our service area. Certain visitors from certain countries can come certainly with just a passport, and of course, US citizens. What are the rights of immigrants in general? As Helena had stated earlier, in Massachusetts, and Massachusetts is obviously thankful for the work that you all do, is one of the more liberal and accommodating humanitarian-based states. So the rights here in Massachusetts are greater than a lot of states, especially those in the South. But all immigrants have the rights to be treated for medical emergencies and potentially receive Mass Health Limited. I'm sure you've all had interactions with Mass Health. They're great to work with. They have the right to remain silent as any other United States citizen would if they are accused of a crime. They have certain other protections. They're to be read the Miranda rights, for example, if they're arrested. They're free from workplace discrimination, or at least in theory, and that includes their national origin or citizenship. They have a right to free, appropriate public education, as everyone in this room knows. And this one actually comes up quite a bit with our folks. They have a right to travel domestically within the United States with a valid ID. Just to touch on that for a second, we get a lot of questions about people wanting to visit family members in other states and fly. As long as they meet whatever requirements the airlines have in terms of identification, they can do so. Real ID has been perpetually pushed back because not every state has launched it, including Rhode Island. So that is not necessary, but I would just ask them to defer to their airline carrier. Go ahead. Another question that comes up quite a bit, and I think this is very important to point out, because what we're concerned with ultimately is that the people who come here are ultimately able to find a way to stay lawfully and legally, but they can sometimes make critical mistakes along the way that will compromise that ability. And one of the ways that they compromise their, not intentionally, but they do compromise their own ability to stay, is to make bad decisions with regards to things like showing up for court dates. So in Massachusetts in particular, sensitive locations are places where immigration and customs or immigration enforcement should not make arrests. Now, these are to include schools, healthcare facilities, places of worship, religious or civil ceremonies, public marches, parades, rallies, such as those on the State House. And most importantly, for the point I'm trying to make, the courthouses and surroundings, with the caveat that if there's an imminent risk of violence or there's a public safety measure or a protocol in place that requires ICE to pick someone up, an immigrant up there, they can. Now, that has been something I'm sure you've seen in the news that has gone both directions, even in the most recent past. Sometimes ICE will enter the courthouses, and they probably should not. But the point I am trying to make, and I urge you to make to your constituency, is a lot of folks will find themselves in trouble with the law, often unintentionally. They don't know the law of the land. Could be things as innocuous as driving without a license. Please encourage them to show up to their court dates. We hear over and over again that they blow them off because they're afraid that ICE is going to pick them up at the courthouse, and then unfortunately that negatively impacts our ability to effectively get them or obtain a enhanced legal status for them. So just please know that. Next. And by the way, at any point, if you want to stop me, ask any questions, please feel free. Otherwise, I certainly have reserved some room at the end for that. Let's talk a little bit about healthcare and Mass Health. Again, Helena touched on it, which I appreciate. As you all know, there are varying levels of Mass Health. The standard, which is what we would call a qualified non-citizen, there are various degrees of folks who are eligible for that. Green card holder is certainly eligible. Somebody who's here with VAWA, which is a visa under the Violence Against Women Act for over 5 years, they're eligible. If they've been granted asylum or refugee status, or any status or undocumented, if they are pregnant or under the age of 21. Very important. There's also the connector care level of Mass Health. Qualified non-citizens, certain green card holders would be eligible for that. VAWA holders who have had the VAWA status for less than 5 years. If they have a pending asylum, a bona fide asylum pending with USCIS, TPS status, temporary protected status. I believe, I don't know if it was Corinne or Helena or both, may have mentioned SIJ earlier, special immigrant juvenile status, which is either pending or approved. And if they have a work permit or other temporary status. For the family assistance level, true call means present under the color of law. DACA is basically the main category that falls under there. The DACA rules keep changing on a daily basis, but by and large, most people who were able to use that law, which Obama had put in place, are renewing their DACA status, but there aren't new DACA applications necessarily. And then limited, as was pointed out, everybody, regardless of their status, is eligible for at least the most limited form of Mass Health. I did see a question pop up. I don't know if you wanted me to address that, Jen, or wait till the end.
Yeah, no, feel free. If a U.S. citizen applies for their children to come to the U.S. and they're given a visa, what's the process mom has to go through to get them to stay in the U.S.?
So if a U.S. citizen parent applies for a child for a visa, then
Yeah.
basically if they are approved, then the next part of the process is what's called consular processing. And that's done through the National Visa Center. So it's basically a process that's broken up into two parts. The initial application is reviewed by USCIS. Once approved, it's then forwarded to the National Visa Center. The National Visa Center then will be in touch with either the attorney, if they have an attorney, or the petitioners, and give them a second set of instructions for other documents that they have to file, the certain biographical information, healthcare information. A lot of times enhanced financial information will be provided at that point. And essentially at that point, they're working with the consulate where they're currently residing. Now, I don't want to get overly complicated because sometimes those applications happen and the kids are already here, which opens a whole other can of worms. And the big question is, do they have to go back for processing? Generally speaking, there are quite a few ways around that, but it's not exhaustive either. So again, if the person who's being sponsored is still in their home country, it's a pretty fluid process, USCIS through the National Visa Center. And the National Visa Center it can be very tough to deal with because a lot of their automated systems are very wonky. But the one good thing that I've experienced in the past is it's pretty easy to speak to somebody at a consulate, at least in Central and South American, Caribbean countries, countries that aren't necessarily under constant threat of warfare. It's a little bit tougher in, say, Western Africa, the Middle East, but the constituencies we see, the consulates are pretty responsive, and they'll help folks with rescheduling interviews, appointments, things of that nature. I hope that answered that question. Okay, why not get a better status? So, especially on the news, you would think that basically anybody who's entering this country as an immigrant is trying to game the system. And I think we all know that that's not the case. One of the refrains you'll hear is, well, why not just get a better status, or why not become a green card holder? Unfortunately, not that easy. Typically, you have to go in a pretty specific order. You enter from your home country, either on a claim of asylum or with a valid visa. At some point when you're eligible to do so, depending on how you entered, you can apply for the green card or lawful permanent residency, and eventually you can apply for citizenship, although not everybody does. But it's not a linear process because not everybody is treated equally by the United States government. Next slide, please. And what I mean by that is you can't just apply and get in line. It's not a first come, first served process, and there are essentially different silos that are set up. There are more than 4 lines, but we broke this presentation down into the 4 categories that you'll most often see people trying to enter the country or have been entered through. 2 of these are probably more prevalent or relevant to what we're talking about, but the main 4 are family members of U.S. residents or green card holders, highly skilled workers or business investors, Somebody who we would say has a quote unquote painful past, which could be asylum, crime victim, or other humanitarian reasons. And then there's the worldwide visa lottery. For all intents and purposes, the second and fourth one don't really apply to, I think, what we see or you're going to be seeing. I don't imagine that many of you are servicing, business investors or athletes from the Dominican Republic. You're dealing with people who have come here on a more pressing life or death situation. So you're going to see family members of U.S. citizens or LPRs or people who are here in that quote unquote painful past category. Forget about the visa lottery. I've never even heard anybody getting a visa through that. I know it happens, but it's not something we see. That all being said, even if you have a successful claim to a status, there are things that could complicate that. The most common for us, at least, and I'm sure for a lot of you, is some of these folks unfortunately have a criminal history, and that will affect their ability to be approved for certain statuses, or at least the timing of the approval. Life events while online, that's very common. People apply and they're a certain age. By the time that their case is going to be adjudicated or reviewed by USCIS, they are now married, may have children, they may be divorced, and they were actually being sponsored by a spouse. Or unfortunately, finances matter. Insufficient finances. If the government believes you're going to come here to just be on the public dole, it does reserve the right to deny an application. So the ability to support yourself once here does get factored in. Next. This is one of the slides that I noticed is probably not 100% accurate, but just as a general, give you a general idea of how long it takes. Because again, we hear in the media that they should just get a legal status, and not that easy. For example, if a U.S. citizen tries to sponsor a spouse, child, or parent to join them, that can take 2 to 3 years, generally speaking. It's actually become a little bit quicker from what we're seeing, but it's still not any quicker than 18 months or so. So it's not an overnight process. Victims of crime to gain entry to the United States, such as the U visa, 6 to 8 years. U.S. citizens request to marry an adult child or request their married adult child to join them. I've seen as long as 25 years for that to be approved. Those visas are limited. It does matter where you are when you're applying. We are in a busier immigrant area, and so those waiting times are long. They're not as long as, say, New York or California, but they are long. And persons fleeing persecution requests or seeking asylum, I mean, we just give you an example. We have a case that was brought to the immigration court in 2015. And yesterday we just got a notice that they're not even their final hearing, but what's called their basically case management hearing is scheduled now for December of 2026. So 11 years they've been in the court process. And that's fairly typical, unfortunately. I did see another question pop up, Jen.
Sorry. Yeah, if someone comes here and marries a U.S. citizen, do you still have to follow that same process?
Generally speaking. So the question then becomes, is the person who came here, did they come here completely undocumented without inspection? Are they here with a pending court case? So the timing of it and the eligibility will matter on those factors. It's not unfortunately an apples to apples explanation, but the process is generally the same. And I'm sure you heard just last week, President Biden announced what's called the Parole in Place program. We're already getting questions about that. And by most estimates, about 550,000 people who are currently here will be under this program will be allowed to stay here while those types of petitions are being adjudicated. So they will not be forced to leave and go back to their home countries waiting for that. So it's expected that that will be challenged by numerous states, and there'll be lawsuits flying left and right. It's not the law of the land yet, but the idea is to give some relief to those people who have come into the country, no matter how they came into the country, if they are being properly sponsored by a spouse. There's a couple other categories that they don't have to leave while their petition is being adjudicated.
Kenneth, I just have to ask, I guess, just a very broad question, and this reflects my complete absence of really any knowledge on this topic. But what is it that takes so long to adjudicate all these petitions? Is it the complexity of the laws? Is it the sheer numbers of people we're talking about? Is a combination of both? What, you know, for those of us who are outside, we, you know, hear the sort of garbled mess that immigration has become, and it's just for years and years this has happened, and I just, you know, I just wish there were better solutions and something that was more efficient. What is that? What would you say that is behind all of that?
You hit the nail on the head. It's all of the above. And I would add to that I don't want to get too legal, but the way that the immigration system is set up is actually counterintuitive to justice. And so, for example, immigration court is administered through the Department of Justice, which it should actually be the opposite. So, for example, just think of it at a local level. A prosecutor is presenting a case to a judge, right? That is, there's a check and balance there. A judge is supposed to be an impartial arbiter, and a prosecutor works for a different department in government. In immigration, the prosecutors, or PDs as they're called, are actually prosecuting the cases in the same department where the judges are employed. So it's kind of it's a very convoluted system. And what I would add to that is, because of the way that the law is laid out, every administration that happens, so since 1986, think of the variety of presidents we've had, they're allowed to issue new laws, new administrative procedures, and then lawsuits happen, and there are different Supreme Courts who lean different ways and will put stops on certain things. So as things are progressing, all of a sudden, dead halt, stop. Maybe a certain type of case is not adjudicated for a year while litigation is playing out, and then they go. And then I use the term a lot, best laid plans. President Biden, I think, intended the right thing when he said that the new entries, this is when he first became president, would be adjudicated immediately. The thought process was, let these people come into the country because they're facing extreme violence in their homelands. At least they're safe here, but we'll give them an expedited court hearing. The problem is it knocked everybody else who was already in line back years. So there's always an unintended consequence. And then the last thing I'll say, and I experienced this firsthand with a couple of my cases when I was in private practice, when the pandemic happened, a lot of the guys and girls who work for USCIS, who were close to retirement age, chose to retire. And at a certain point, I believe in 2021, USCIS, by some estimates, was working at about 50% capacity. And that set the whole system back years. And they're still really trying to catch up from that. So.
Okay, well, that's helpful. That overview is helpful, and I know that there's a lot to all of this. I know that there's a couple more questions. Let me just throw one more out, and then I'm going to hold and let you get back to it. What does forced to leave look like?
It depends. So in practice, in the final stages, if that's what we're asking, if there's a deportation order that is put in place, there is a date set with it. They're not whisked off and put on an airplane. They're typically given a certain amount of time to get their affairs in order, round up their belongings, say goodbye. It's typically not overnight, 30 days, 60 days. And there are arrangements being made where they are to depart, usually it's via plane to wherever country they're being sent to. Now, earlier in that process, there are sometimes deportation orders that have yet to be challenged. They can appeal. Everybody's entitled to an appeal. So we actually, in our practice here, very rarely see clients get to the point of a final deportation order. And then there's one other wrinkle that you should know about, is that at certain points, depending on what their country of origin is, the country of origin may not have a working relationship in that regard with the United States, and it may actually be impossible to send some of these people back to their home countries. Let's use Haiti as an example right now. I know they're allegedly sending people back now. I don't see practically how that's going to work because of the instability of the country. So sometimes those orders, even though there's a date certain set to them, they end up dragging out much longer than you would even think.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to let you move on here to your presentation, so keep going.
Next. Okay, this section I do think is important, and like I said, I don't want to certainly keep you all day, and I'm going to cut some at the end, but this is important for providers because you have your boots on the ground, and you're actually seeing, and I've dealt with this with Corinne. We did a clinic at CEDC a few months ago, where, you know, immigrants will come in with a handful of papers and cards, and they just hand them to you and they say, this is what I have. And so your ability to make sense of what they're showing you is going to at least impact how you're able to give them advice, even if it's as simple advice as you need to see a lawyer. So the kind of gold standard, other than a citizenship, would be the permanent residency, the eponymous green card. Everybody's heard the term green card. Generally speaking, what you see on your screen is what it looks like. Again, we've already kind of gone over what the rights are, but in short, it's as close to as you can get to a citizenship. You can apply for citizenship in 3 to 5 years, depending on how you obtain the green card. It's typically 5, a very, very limited, few exceptions are 3 years. But after 5 years, you're eligible for all public benefits as if you were a citizen. How do you get that? I think we already touched on that, but a spouse, parent, child, or sibling in the United States, somebody who's sponsored you, petitioned for you. Ideally, you would have minimal criminal history or substance abuse history, immigration violation history, but even that can be overcome. Keep in mind, in thinking through all of this, the entirety of the immigration code has the term discretionary sprinkled throughout it. So the government maintains ultimate discretion on the way they adjudicate any petition or any court case. So, you know, there are certain things that are going to prohibit somebody from getting a green card. I mean, obviously if they've committed murder, they're not being granted a green card status. But somebody, for example, who might have a DUI, if they've done counseling classes and they've stayed out of trouble for 5 years, that can be an application that's approved. So there's generally speaking not certain things that are automatic bars, other than, you know, again, you know, felonies, you know, the severe felonies, but people can improve their chances by taking remedial actions. And I think that's important for service providers. Always encourage them, go to their court dates and get help, you know, get the mental health counseling and substance abuse counseling, because that will help their chances when they do their applications. Work permit, that's the big buzzword in Massachusetts now, ever since basically 2022. The government wants to get people working so they can get them out of the temporary shelters. And now there's the 9-month rule, which is going to complicate things. So this is generally speaking what a work permit, or also known as an EAD, looks like. It's a temporary status has been granted, which makes them eligible for that. There are a variety of them. I don't want to get bogged down in that. I just want you to be aware of what it looks like. Importantly, because with that comes other rights, and they will certainly in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts be eligible for a driver's license, other types of public benefits. They can work and live lawfully in the United States. This slide says 1 or 2 years. They're extending some of the work cards so that these folks don't have to renew them every year, which was a particularly onerous process. And really stupid, honestly, for the government to have to keep processing those renewals. So they're starting their 3 and 5 year ones, and even longer in certain circumstances. Next. Asylum. Asylum is the big buzzword of the political world, as I'm sure you've heard. There was also a recent proclamation made by President Biden that now this is kind of on the other side of the fence, where claiming asylum at the border, southern border in particular, is going to be a lot harder now. The people who are attempting to enter are going to have to use certain phrases and terminology to be eligible for asylum, whereas prior to that, or up until now, basically the Customs and Border Patrol, as they are screening people, I don't want to say they were feeding them the right information, but they were asking them specific questions, such as, are you afraid to return to your home country? Well, obviously they're all going to say yes. Are you afraid to return to your home country because of something you cannot change, such as your race, religion, nationality? Essentially, they were spoon feeding them the answers. The immigrants are savvy. They know how to answer those questions. The new dictate that's come down from above, and again, this could be challenged, is that they have to make a proclamation to the Border Patrol affirmatively without being asked these questions. So they are going to need to know what to tell the Border Patrol in order to be admitted to the country. Now, this doesn't mean they're granted asylum. Basically, we'll give them the ability to cross the border to further claim asylum. They're given a notice to appear at a court date. We'll actually get into that in a second. I don't want to get ahead of myself. Asylum, here's what I think you need to know, other than what I just said, is that it's not a cure-all. And I think Helena said 90% of the people who claim it will be denied, and that's absolutely true. There's a lot of misinformation in our communities, and I would be particularly wary for you folks from the Brazilian community, and I don't mean that to pick on them. We have a lot here in Fall River. They tend to coach each other on certain things to say, thinking it will get them approved for asylum, where it doesn't, and it doesn't meet the legal specifications. And so I would encourage people, again, obviously refer them to an attorney, but I would encourage, your people as you encounter them to, think through what their options are. Even, at CEDC, when we did that clinic, some of the people who were coming in claiming that they were going to claim asylum, we found out they had people or family members living here who could actually sponsor them. But they were so hung up on this idea of asylum that that's what they were coached on and what they were told to say, that they overlooked that they actually had relatives here who could potentially sponsor them and get them into the country or allow them to stay in a much more efficient way without being rejected. So next slide. I didn't mention this, I'll mention it in a bit, but our legal or immigration department is split up into two departments. One of the sub-departments deals particularly with victims of crime. A U visa is something that can be a very useful mechanism for some of these folks, because unfortunately a lot of them have been or are victims of crime. So the criteria to at least apply for a U visa is that the immigrant has to have been a victim of a serious crime that occurred in the United States. It has to be a violent crime, assault, domestic violence is huge, sexual assault, child abuse, or forced to work where the employer uses threats, maybe will steal their immigration documents, deprives them of food, wages, housing. This is happening at an unprecedented level in Fall River and New Bedford, particularly New Bedford, from what we're hearing. Essentially, they're being held hostage, and it's even more devious than that. They're being convinced to come into the country with promises that they'll be given housing, work, certain wages, food, clothing, all the things you need to survive. And then once they're put into an apartment with 10 other people, they're told, you're not getting paid. And sometimes their documents are stolen, but oftentimes it's just a threat. Hey, if you rabble rouse, we're going to report you to ICE and you're going to be deported. These folks don't know their rights, and there's a veil of silence. So I would, to whatever degree possible, try to convince, if you see that. The governor of Massachusetts a couple months ago issued a proclamation that anybody who reports a labor violation will not be reported to immigration. So regardless of their status, they are encouraged to make reports to the Attorney General, Department of Labor, any of the mechanisms, even their local police can help them out. And they will, there's a rule in place that those agencies are not to report them to immigration. So please, if they're basically being traded as slaves, and encourage them to report it to the best of your ability. Next. And by the way, we're going to share the slideshow with you too. So stuff I'm skipping, you can certainly have, and obviously Jen's recording this too. Citizenship, this is big in presidential years because there's always a fear in immigrant communities that if there's a new president, especially if that president is a Republican, that the rules around citizenship are going to change. And so we get a lot of citizenship calls since January. Generally speaking, you have to have been a green card holder for 5 years, 3 years in certain circumstances, such as if you were obtained through a marriage to a U.S. citizen. You have to have good moral character for that period of time and able to pass a civics and English exam. Again, I don't know how much this applies to the work that you all are doing, but one thing I did want to point out is everybody, not everybody, but a lot of people want to see if they can have their civics or English exam waived. Not speaking English is not grounds for that. You have to, there's a waiver, it's called the I-648, has to be filed along with the petition, and there has to be a valid, usually medical reason why they cannot participate in that exam. So unfortunately, if they apply for it, they do have to study and they do have to learn some basic English to answer some very basic civics questions. And I just wanted to mention that because it's a strong, just urban myth in the immigrant community that they can just, because they don't speak English, they can get those waived, but that is not true. Next. Okay, papers again. So you already saw basically what it is that's important: the permanent resident or the green card, the EAD, a visa. Visas can take different forms. That's not the only form that you'll see. I'm sure you're all familiar with a social security card because we all have them. I think more importantly is probably the next two slides. You're often going to see some of your constituency hand you usually crumbled up papers, out of order, missing pages that look like these two papers. And these are called notices to appear. Generally speaking, in our communities, what we're seeing is the folks who are let into the country who have claimed asylum but are not entered legally, they're given a notice to appear. So essentially what's happening is the government is saying to them, there's a strong enough public safety protocol in place that we think sending you back to your country will be a danger to you. So we're going to let you in, but you are hereby put on notice that you have a court date. And that's a deportation hearing. It's a deportation proceeding. Now, as we've already discussed, those can take years. So while they're here, there are things they can do to get the statuses they need, at least get a work card and start to work their way up socioeconomically. But this is probably the most important paper, and it's probably the paper that gets lost the most. And so, if you run into constituency that says, hey, I entered, I got something at the border, some paper, if they show you something like this, take it seriously, because that will capture when their court date is, where their court date is. Then there's a whole set of issues that come along with that, whether they need to update their address with the government so that their court date is moved. Because a lot of times they're entering through the southern border, they're given a court date in Texas. Well, now they live in Massachusetts. We have to get that moved. These are all things, by the way, that pro bono attorneys such as ourselves or low bono can help with, and people like Corinne do. She does that herself, and I know the IAC does it as well. Those are things that can easily be remedied, and it's very important for these people to be held accountable, because God forbid they miss a court date and get deported in absentia. That's not a good thing. So be very cognizant if somebody shows you something like this. The next set of paper that you'll see is a little less common, but also very important. It's called the Order of Supervision, or USUP. Sometimes it's called. That is basically an order that's given along with the NTA, typically asking the immigrant or demanding the immigrant that they check in with ICE periodically. Now, that can be phone call, it can be online, it can be in person. Sometimes they're given monitoring devices to be put on their ankles. There are different ways this can play out. The important thing is if somebody that you're treating shows you this, or you're serving shows you this, make sure that they're actually showing up to those. Man, same thing. If they were ordered to see ICE in a different state, well, then there are things in place, mechanisms where we can change the venue. Sometimes we're even able to get them to have the in-person check-ins waived altogether, and they can just do it via phone or teleconference. So just be aware of that paper, because that's something that they ignore, unfortunately, and that gets them in trouble down the line. Next. All right, the next one, the last of the papers, is what we call the I-94, which would be on the next slide. It can take many forms. It typically looks like one of the two that you'll see. The one on the right is the online version of it. The one on the left is almost like a little receipt that they're given. This shows that they were lawfully admitted to the United States. So this will be for the immigrants who came in lawfully. Now, it's important to note that we often need these to apply for different types of statuses down the line. And they are notoriously easy to lose because they're literally the size of a driver's license in some instances. And they're not always given to them. And this happens all over the world. I mean, this is not just, South and Central American and Caribbean residents. I mean, I've had immigrants from Italy, from England, where they don't get an I-94. Somebody was asleep at the wheel when they were let in. So just be aware if you see that, make sure it's something they don't lose, they keep it, they take note of the number at the very least, because that's information they are going to need down the line. All right, so the next section, really the next two sections, is just a little bit of what we do. because, we are taking cases. We're not taking everything right now, but we do want to help and we do want to be a resource for everybody here. So I just want to give you a basic overview of what it is we do, how to reach us, and then we can wrap up with some questions. So as I just mentioned, we are essentially split into two sub-departments. The first one is called ILEAP, Immigration Law Education and Advocacy Project. What we do in that department is with low cost, or sometimes basically no cost, help for areas of immigration law such as citizenship, green cards, asylum, health-based extensions or waivers, TPS, DACA, work permits, deportation defense. We're probably going to be getting away from because we just have so many cases still in the court system that has become onerous, but it never hurts to ask. The other side is the IVRP, which I mentioned, the Immigrant Victims Representation Project. Those are for the victims of crime. That is always free by the dictates of the grant that supports that project. We cannot charge for that. And that gives legal assistance for immigrant survivors of domestic violence, child abuse or neglect, human trafficking, or other serious crimes. Just also note that in-house right now, we have people here who speak English, Spanish, Portuguese, Khmer, French, German, and I think that's it. We're still struggling with Haitian Creole, but we do have translation services we use for the languages we don't speak in-house. We cannot assist, and this is not really going to be relevant to you by and large, but we can't help people with visitor visas. We definitely not student visas, work visas such as the H1B, H2. Those are, again, they're in a different socioeconomic class, and we're tailoring to people who are truly in need. And this is important because sometimes immigrants will come to us with more than one legal case. They have an immigration case, but they might also have a family court case. They might also have a criminal court case. Well, we only do the immigration portion, but we certainly will refer out for those other areas. In terms of what we take, this is important. So we do have a income threshold, 200% and over of the federal poverty limit. We cannot take. That's per our bylaws. Between 125% and 200% of the federal poverty limit, we charge a very low fee. We have a fee schedule that is extremely low. It's probably the lowest I've seen. And then under 125%, generally speaking, the service is free. There's a $50 surcharge for, we have a case software system that charges us that amount to start a case. So we just offset it. But I will say this, we don't advertise this, but we basically don't turn anyone away for failure to pay or inability to pay. So if they don't have $50, we're not going to turn them away because they don't have $50. Finally, part 3. If you ever want to refer anybody to us, like I said, you're going to have these slides. You can certainly use any of the mechanisms. Sarah, you can just kind of scroll through this. Everything right now that we're doing is through a phone intake process. So certainly we discourage walk-ins because we won't see them. But all anybody has to do is either call us, or on the next slide, you'll see there's a QR code where they can do a self-intake and somebody will call them. Even if they do happen to walk in, we now have a mechanism in place at the front desk where we have the QR code there, and we also have an intake form. And what we do is our intake coordinator will call them, vet them. If we are taking those types of cases at that time, she'll get the information we need. She meets with me once a week. I decide if it's something we have the capacity to take or fits our criteria, and then I'll assign it to one of our wonderful staff. There's 13 employees and 2 volunteers, which actually 13 is pretty big from what I'm learning about immigration departments at nonprofits. So we do have we have a strong staff. We have the ability to help, and if any of your folks need it, or more importantly, if any of you need it, we're here to just give you advice. And we love doing presentations because not just to social service providers, but also to immigrants, because the biggest thing out there that I think creates problems is a lack of education. And the more educated these folks are as to what their options are and what they can and cannot do, the better their ultimate outcomes are. So any questions?
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kenneth. We're going to just open up the floor for questions. I do want to just read up from the chat. We did have a question earlier that about what the best place is to connect somebody if they're experiencing workforce or labor violations, but are still undocumented. And Corinne Williams did provide the New Bedford Office of Attorney General, the phone number there of 508-990-9700 for labor violations, and provided the address at 700 Pleasant Street right here in downtown New Bedford. So we have that. One of the questions that came up is it true if someone signs an affidavit or support, by law they're obligated to support the family financially until they become a U.S. citizen, which could be 5 years, 10 years? Is that true?
No. So I actually had that my last immigration case in private practice before coming to Catholic Charities actually had to do with that. So I had to seek an advisory opinion, basically, because I wasn't sure, and the law is not entirely clear, as it's usually not. The answer is no. However, what I would say is, so it depends on why you're asking. I know that sometimes the immigrants will ask because they're concerned, will this person be able to continue to quote unquote support me? They rarely ever actually support them, at least past getting them on their feet. Sometimes the person who is the quote unquote financial sponsor who's signing the affidavit is afraid to, because they're afraid that they, as you're asking, committing themselves to supporting this person for a certain period of time. They are not. However, if that person gets into some sort of financial trouble and they have to go on certain public benefits or they get evicted, it is possible that the United States government will ask that sponsor what has changed. Okay, and they want to make sure they're not trying to hold those people to supporting them. They just want to make sure they weren't lying in the first place. They want to make sure that they weren't committing fraud in the immigration process. So as long as the person who signs it has a true and honest belief that they have the ability to at least help that person get their feet on the ground and get assimilated, that's the responsibility. If fraud, and how they would prove that, I mean, if you really want to go down the rabbit hole, I'm not sure that they would ever really hold anybody accountable for that. They're understaffed, undermanned, and underfunded as it is, but the obligation is just to tell the truth, that you have the ability to at least help temporarily. That's all.
Okay. Thank you for that. Do we have other questions on the line? Anything that may not have made it to the chat box, but you're curious about?
I have a question. So I'm glad to hear, Ken, that you're taking referrals.
Yes.
Because we have been actually having a big challenge with that, right? And that's when there's lack of immigration attorneys or immigration attorneys who will take advantage of our population. So it's good. So we can just start referring, because we've actually had to fundraise to get an attorney to take care, especially with special juvenile visas. We've actually had to get someone outside to handle our special juvenile cases. And we actually have a student, a third-year law student from who's doing the screening. So I am very happy that we can start referring our clients, because we have quite a few that are in need. So so should we just contact you directly for referrals?
Yep. Yeah. If you look at and I can email you even separately, but if you look at toward the ends of the slide, there is the intake phone number and email. That's the best way to go. If it comes through you directly or your agency,
Yes.
I believe one of the slides actually says we always give preference to our community partners. And so on a given week, there are weeks where I will say, we don't have the capacity, call back in a month.
Yeah.
But if there are, say, 10 potential cases and 2 of them are referred by you, and we can take 2, we're taking the ones you refer, because we always help other people who are on the same mission.
Yeah, especially with special juvenile visas. At the beginning of my presentation, I mentioned how we're working with the unaccompanied and the parenting teen programs, and we know those students qualify special juvenile visa, and that's been a big challenge. And Corinne and I have had this big challenges. Where do we refer them to? And we know attorneys are asking so much money and just giving them the round. So I'll have to say I'm thrilled to know that you are taking referrals. Thank you.
We always will. And obviously, like I said, if we can't do it for some reason, we will tell you, but we always keep that door open and we ask people to just check back, and we usually can get them in at some point, but we will always prioritize anything from any of you.
Thank you, Kenny.
You're welcome.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Any other questions? Anything folks need to hear before we wrap up? Okay, hearing none. What phenomenal information today, and we're grateful to everyone. We want to thank once again Helena, Corinne, and Kenneth for some outstanding information and for providing such a great information with us. So this concludes our presentation for the day. We will be sending out, we'll be posting the video from this presentation today online, as we mentioned, at nbhspn.com. If you are on the mailing list for the Bristol County Continuum of Care, we will be sending out just a notice of this availability, and we'll be providing both the contact information and the PowerPoint presentation that you saw today. Thank you, Kenneth. I know you'll be sending that along. That we will provide all that information to you. So otherwise, this concludes our presentation. We thank you for your attendance and wish you a phenomenal day. Have a good one.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye, everyone.